Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, dude?
Not too much, man. Today we're going to be chatting about the majority of Canadians feeling uncomfortable with gender identity policies, safe supply drugs being sold by organized crime across Canada, Pope Francis calling for Ukraine to wave the white flag, and Wall Street retreating from activism due to an economic clash. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind giving us a positive review on Spotify or subscribing to our YouTube channel wherever you're watching, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get started. So first off, we've got majority of Canadians uncomfortable with gender identity policies. In a recent Nanios research and CTV news survey, over half of Canadian adults expressed discomfort with transgender policies. The survey found that 57% of respondents were at least somewhat uncomfortable with a transgender person participating in organized sports based on their transitioned quote-unquote gender identity, while 62% were not comfortable with hormone therapy for individuals under 18 years of age. And additionally, 64% expressed discomfort with schools not notifying parents when their child wants to use a new preferred name or pronoun. So is any of this surprising to you?
I mean, look, it's not really surprising at this point. I think what we've come to agree upon in general is that this movement crossed the line, right? They kind of crossed the line from equality, and they're sort of veering towards insanity on a few policies. And that's really what this is about, right? So I think what can be a bit of a challenge with these discussions is that often people feel like if you say anything about this stuff whatsoever, you're anti-LGBT, you're a bigot, you're a list of things. But the reality is, there are just a few lines that you can't cross. Otherwise, people in general don't really care what you do with your time. If you want to dress any way you want to behave any way you want, that's fine. There's just a few key things we can't do. In my opinion, allowing biological men to play in women's sports. That's one of them. And, people use this excuse, well, there's not that many, Jonathan, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect your life, blah, blah, blah. Well, it affects a lot of lives of the women, the biological women that work very hard to play those sports and to excel and maybe get a scholarship and maybe have some sort of future in that space. So it affects them. But the other problem I have with that is right now the argument is, well, there's not that many. Okay, well, how many is too many, right? Because it started with one, now there are thousands. People are like, there's not thousands. Well, actually, there are. If you go look at what's happening in the United States, there are literally thousands at this point. So you kind of have to ask yourself, when does it stop? What are we doing here, right? Or do we just get to the point that all women's teams are just men's B teams, with biological men? And I was thinking about this the other day. I kind of had a laugh where, think about the World Cup, right? All you need is one team to have a bunch of dudes on that team. And then everywhere else in the world, they're going to be like, all right, we're sticking a bunch of trans men on our teams too. Otherwise, we can't compete, right? So this just, for me, that's crossing the line. Another thing that crosses the line here is excluding parents from decision-making of children. And look, this isn't just about gender ideology. This is about everything. And what's interesting for me is that in every other realm, in every other discussion, every other topic, everything else that has to do with the child, we trust the parents to raise the kids until they're 18. Yet for some reason, when it comes to mutilating your genitalia, we think that kids have got this all figured out, and schools are going to help them get there via, the state, the government. So if you exclude parents from any of the decision making, that's just completely
in Canada,
wrong.
There's no such thing as parental rights, Jonathan,
right,
according to NDP MPs.
Right, but that's insane, right? So this is why, you kind of look at these things and you go, well, you're crossing the line from maybe what you thought was equality, and you're veering towards insanity. The other two big things, rather. Providing minors with hormone blockers or transition surgery. Look, there's not enough science to support what they're currently doing. But here's the things that we do know. When you give people hormone blockers, it is irreversible and you are causing damage. We know that. Doesn't matter what they say. There is science to support that. And when you're transitioning minors, what's the list of you can't smoke a cigarette, you can't get a tattoo, you can't watch porn, you can't vote, you can't drink. There's such a long list of things to do that you can't do. But for some reason, we accept this one, which is life-changing. And what we do know is that they can never reproduce, so you're sterilizing them. And you know what? To be honest, they may never be able to have orgasms, which, hey, let's be realistic here. Sex is a really, really great part of life. And if you don't get to enjoy any of that because of some terrible decision, some woke ideological perspective got baked into your brain and you look at that and you go, I just feel so bad. So that, again, that's crossing the line. And then The last one for me really is allowing any predatory scenario to play out. And a good example of that is when that 50-plus-year-old man decided that he was a 13-year-old girl in Orangeville and he was going to go swim with them, but not just swim and compete, but also use their change rooms and their showers. And that is completely offside. That is wildly inappropriate. So it's really just those things. It's really those 4 to 5 things where sane, logical people are going, no, this is way too far. And that's why you're seeing this pushback. It's not anti-LGBTQ, it's anti-insanity.
I was actually quite surprised by these numbers. Like only 57% of people thinking that it's somewhat uncomfortable with a transgender person participating in organized sports. It's like, that's not, like, sure, that's a majority, but that's not a hard leaning majority, one that you would think would be blatantly obvious. There's a few good points that I've heard made in regards to the transgender sports stuff, because people will get into the argument about, oh, well, it's just hormone levels, and therefore if you reduce a male's hormone levels, that he'll be at the same competition level and blah, 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 right? And there's a really good argument to be made from an evolutionary standpoint that men's motor function developed differently than women's due to our role as the hunters in the group. So for instance, even just spatial awareness and being able to track an object moving across a plane and being able to time with, say, your throwing of the spear, they've actually shown that on evolutionary standpoint that men are more adept for that kind of performance. So it's almost like even ingrained into our brain of being able to spatial awareness everything. It's just different. And then when you look at the, even if it is just, let's even give them the benefit of the doubt, even if it wasn't thousands and it was just a handful, you see certain competitors like Fallon Fox in the female MMA world transferring from, going transgender and then fighting against females, literally crushing female skulls.
Yeah.
Like this isn't just, she put up 10 points, like an extra 10 points over the record and smashed this, or powerlifting where, okay, they put the one bar. It's like, we're literally talking about irreversible damage to people for their entire lives. And so to me, to see just 57% of people uncomfortable with that on some sort of level, seems low.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at studies like this, or you look at any sort of poll, you have to consider a couple of things. And what for me, that's like, what's the age group would probably be the primary issue.
Yeah.
So if this was all a bunch of Gen X and maybe boomers, I think you'd see that in the 80s easily.
For sure.
You know what I mean? Even if it were just even millennials, I don't think. Well, you have a reasonable number of millennials that are really on board with a lot of this stuff, the Gen Zs as well. So I think it just depends who you ask, right? And that's why I think when you do these things, you want a wide array, because don't forget, I think the average age of a Canadian right now is around 38.
Okay.
So if you use that, you go, okay, well, the average age right now is a millennial. So if you split both ways and go, okay, 10 years up, 10 years down on average, you know what I mean? You can understand maybe why it's only 57%. And I would imagine that a lot of these people, if you're in the 38 and below, a lot of them don't even have kids, right? And like, I'm having kids. I'm super excited about it, but it does change your perspective on these things. Like, these things do come across as a lot more predatory when you do have one of your own little ones to protect, right? So that may be one contributing factor. But actually, to your point about biological differences, Chris Williamson was on Joe Rogan the other day, and he was talking about a study. And it was exactly talking about what you were saying there, with how their ability to just sort of, their depth perception and ability to track is different. He said that you can see differences at like a 90 to 95% consistency. You can see the difference between a male and a female 3 months before they're born. So while they're still in the womb. So just after 6 months from conception, you can start seeing substantial differences where they can say, like, with 90 to 95%, which is the same percentage, around the same percentage of you be able to tell whether it's a guy or a girl if you're looking at them. That's how much they know that even at that point, we're different. We're just different. And it's wild to think otherwise. And, when you think about like the physical impact of a male hitting a female, I know this is a little bit weird, but this is the way that I consider it. When you look at like other animals fighting other animals, you look at a bear. A bear can fight another bear, and they can manage that they can manage that impact. But if a bear touches you, you are dead in 3 seconds or less. You're not equipped to manage it. And it seems to be like some sort of, I don't know how the universe works. I don't really understand, but there seems to be some sort of order to things where a guy can hit a guy and it doesn't cause as much damage. It's like we're built to both provide and take the impact almost at the same level. You know what I mean? And I realize there's a spectrum to these things, but we're talking about people that are fighting in MMA. So we're talking about people that are at that, they're in that echelon. But then you take a guy and you're hitting a woman, it's just, consider the bone density. It's just completely different. It's like it's just, there's no comparison. It doesn't matter what you do. If they've gone through puberty, you can go through a ton of things to try to I don't know, let's call it steal their mojo, because that's kind of what you're doing. But at the end of the day, they fully developed their hips, their shoulders, their bone density. Everything is different. To pretend like, well, we're just going to take them off testosterone. Come on, man. It's unscientific, and it's so ridiculous that we're playing this charade.
Another interesting aspect in regards to this conversation is how minor changes in policy, like preferential policy, is major changes in moral differences from people's lenses. So, for instance, I think a lot of the right and left both believe and both look at the transgender thing, and both of their stances are based on what do we think is best for kids. So, for instance, the right would typically say that, you're doing life-altering surgery, you're actually negatively affecting these kids, it's better to just let them develop. And then the left would typically say that these kids are struggling and they need some sort of intervention and help in order to push them along with their issues and push them through them. And so both are coming at it from this standpoint of we want to do what's best for kids, but then a slight difference in how you think that should be approached, what you actually think is best for kids, all of a sudden gets blown up into this massive, well, you're an evil person trying to mutilate children, or you're a evil person that's trying to be anti-LGBTQ or whatever, right? So it's these minor differences, even though it's the same goal, which is to look out for the children. And yeah, it is crazy to me that it's gotten to this point where slight differences on the proposed method for dealing with societal problems either means you're the devil or you're saint-like.
Well, I mean, I think that is sort of in a nutshell how politics work, right? Because at the end of the day, whether it's economics, whether it's housing, whether it's equality, whether it's protecting children, education, each side thinks they're doing the right thing to fix it. And I think what's wild to me, and you make a good point, is that it's such a small difference in opinion, but you see how that thing at the top of the pyramid there, and then how it spreads down and how different it becomes once it's fully realized. And again, I think that's just sort of a symptom of our political system. Everyone seems to think they've got it all figured out. But when it comes to stuff like this, to me, it just feels so illogical. So when you make a decision at the top, right, and you go, we want to protect the children. We want to protect them by providing them with gender transition surgery, okay? Or we want to protect them by not doing something that's insane. Now, that's my perspective, obviously, coming through, but you see how each side thinks they're protecting, right? Now, when you make that decision, when you have to see how that comes to fruition, right? It's like your housing policy. Well, we're going to do this. We're going to put all this money into this housing accelerator. Okay, but it doesn't actually build homes. So when you see how that actually comes to life, you go, well, this was a very ineffective policy. So it's watching it work its way down when you start to understand, was this effective, right? So when you see at the top and they say, well, our goal is to protect children. That's what the left is saying on this particular issue. Okay, cool. I'm on board with that. But when you see how it's come to fruition, which has got, kids, like I said, they're transitioning kids so they're sterile. They can never have orgasms. They're allowing 50-year-old men into little girls' change rooms. Like, okay, well here was your idea, but here's how it played out. So you have to have the wherewithal, or politicians rather should have the wherewithal, but people like you and I in society do, where we go, that was your idea, here's how it played out. It played out very poorly. So now we need to go back and we need to fix it. However, politicians never admit they're wrong. That is political suicide. So they make these decisions, not realizing how bad it's going to get, and then they will die on that hill because that's how this game works. That's what actually bothers me the most about this political system, is that no one will admit, hey, we tried something, it didn't pan out. Let's go the other way. Because all of a sudden you lose 5, 10, 20 points in the polls and your party loses power, and that's all that these people care about. So people like us have to say, hey, logically speaking, this doesn't make any sense. And it is very reasonable to be opposed to these issues because they do not promote equality. Most are divisive, they're unnecessary, and quite frankly, they lack sufficient scientific validation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And don't get me wrong. I think there's one side of this conversation that's clearly wrong. When you look at the data on these kind of things, it's very clear. Even if you look at all of the countries that were leading the charge on these type of policies and treatments and stuff in Europe, all of them are reversing course.
100%.
Like even the Tavistock clinic in the UK was undergoing crazy amounts of lawsuits. Like I think it was like 1,600 lawsuits, and then all of a sudden they were just like, okay, we need to shut this down. So I do think there is a clear cut right side to this argument, but what is, to your point about the political side of it, I don't think it's ever actually going to change until we get a new party in charge, because
unfortunately,
like you're talking about, and then it is scary to think too. You go, okay, well, let's say the current coalition was to win in 2025, and
I'd be vacating this country so fast. Me and my young family would be getting the fuck out of Canada.
I'd be doing a reverse Mexican. I'd be immigrating to Mexico. I'll take my chances with the cartel.
We just want to tell you, we got a really good strategy if you want to start a new life. So here's the plan. You take a one-way flight to Mexico. You come in through the southern border of the United States. You take a free bus ride from Texas to New York. You line up, you get your free $10,000 debit card, which requires no ID, and then you buy new identification off gangbangers in Queens. Boom, new life started with like $9,900 in your pocket.
Sounds pretty good, actually.
Not that bad.
It's not a bad call. Moving on here to the second story of the day, we've got safe supply drugs being sold by organized crime across Canada. So police in British Columbia, Canada, have seized a large quantity of prescription drugs originally intended for a harm reduction program called Safe Supply. These drugs were then found to be in the hands of organized crime groups that were selling them across the country. So how does that end up happening? How do the drugs find their way into the hands of these organized crime?
Yeah, so from what I understand, there's a couple things. Obviously, there's got to be some sort of racket of them just sending guys and girls in there to just get their free drugs and bring them back for some sort of fixed fee, obviously. The other thing that they said they were seeing is that people were going for their safe supply drugs and then trading them off for more potent drugs.
It's like when you've got a shit sandwich that your mom made at high school and you're just like,
trade it.
I'll trade you that for 2 chicken nuggets.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's happening. Yeah, I'll trade your tuna sandwich for these yeah, exactly. So that's from what I understand, that's one of the primary ways of doing it. But here's the other thing. It's happening at such a large scale. There seems to be so much. If they are selling it across the country at this point, I have to assume there's someone working on the inside here. Look at anything that's happening in the government. There seems to be a certain amount of corruption. And I don't really want to point fingers at anybody in particular on this issue, just to say that seems to be a symptom of our government. And I don't know that it's any better if there are conservatives in place. I don't know enough about it. But we do know that the efficiency of spending at the federal level is probably between 10 and 20%, which means there's a lot of bloat and very, very likely a lot of corruption. So you look at this and you go, okay, well, you guys are giving away good, clean drugs, hard drugs for free. What do you think's going to happen? So I'm of the mind, and I don't have any proof of this, but just based on how the system works and how much drugs they found from these organized criminals, they got to have someone on the inside moving this stuff at some sort of fee, because if you're getting it for free from the government, you're selling it at 25%. Your profit margins are massive. That's better than if you were buying drugs from a wholesaler and selling them on the street. Making that 25% on that one flip is really good money. You know what I mean? So you consider this, you're like, this is millions and millions of dollars and it's free hard drugs. You know that they worked their way in there somehow. You know what I mean? So I'm of the mind that they've they've tapped into this government network, and it looks like someone's getting paid to move a reasonable amount of drugs to these guys, because that one-to-one level, that one-to-one trade-off, or just sending people in that don't need the drugs to buy them, how do you convince people to do that? There's not a large enough scale in that operation. So I think it's an inside job. That's what I actually think.
Yeah, there's definitely got to be something sketchy going on there. I think it's funny to just make a distinction between government and organized crime. To me, they're very much so. One of them is just in charge of dealing with their own legal recourse, which never ends up actually happening. But I mean, if you even look at it, it's like, all right, tell me any other organization or institution that can take 50% of your income at essentially gunpoint and tell you if you don't pay it, you're going to go into that little cage.
Jesus
and
Christ.
then it's like that seems pretty criminal to me.
Yeah, good point. Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and then but on the other aspect too, when it comes to these safe supply programs, a lot of people will talk about their necessity for supplying safe drugs, for limiting the amount of overdoses that happens. But again, this is one of those things where you look at the data, it's so clear. Everywhere that these safe supply policies get instituted, they just end up creating a massive drug ring around those cities. Because again, if I'm a user in Saskatchewan, if I'm somebody that is down and out, is using drugs on a constant basis, and I hear that BC is giving out safe in free drugs, like, why would I not go there?
Exactly.
I have every incentive to,
Yeah.
So you all of a sudden just become a hub for these struggling people. And this is something that ties into the transgender conversation a little bit for me too, which I think of, we're looking at all this stuff, and I think they're symptoms of a much larger issue, which is a lack of meaning in people's lives on a day-to-day basis, feeling like their lives are inconsequential, feeling powerless. I mean, we've seen that with polls, right? Showing that more and more people are starting to feel like they don't have control over their lives. This is where you start to go for those things. One, on the drug side, you look for something that's going to check out, like to numb the pain of that powerlessness, of that meaninglessness. And then on the other side, with the transgenderism, when people lack meaning in their lives, they typically start to look to other things to provide importance in their day-to-day, and that's where I see the gender conversation is, or even just identity politics in general. All of a sudden, it's like, my life, my choices don't really matter. So what does matter is the things I have no control over, the things I haven't made choices for, and that is a lot of those identity politics stuff. And you don't hear this in those conversations at all. Like And to me, that's what's the scariest aspect, because I think these things are just going to continue to get worse if we don't start to have a more adult conversation about the nihilism, really, of our current culture. Yeah,
I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I struggle with identity myself sometimes. It has nothing to do with my sexual orientation or preference. It has nothing to do with anything like that. It has to do with my contribution to the world. Because you sit there sometimes and you kind of look at you look at the universe and you feel so small, but you have control over a few things, which are your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions. That's what you can control. And most people want to leave an impact, a positive impact on the world, and they want to really maximize their time on this planet, because we only know about one life. That is a very, very tall order. That is a daunting task to and the thing is, it doesn't go away. People look for purpose all the time. I'm of the mind that your purpose is sort of a moving target. And what I mean by that is, when you're 20 years old, maybe you're an athlete and all you do is play sports. But when you're 70 years old and you have grandkids, well, obviously your purpose in life, it's different. You know what I mean? But look, I struggle with that. You, I'm sure, struggle with it. We want to find a way to do the most we can. Like for me, I want to do the most I can for the world. I do want to leave some sort of impact, and I want it to be very positive. And I do think that I'm capable, so I really want to contribute. And I don't have the answers on how to best do that. And I look at a system sometimes that's very broken and makes it hard for people to really realize their full potential, because the system very much suppresses you and holds you back, holds you down. And, I'm getting close to 40, and I consider myself a very capable individual, and I do take responsibility for my life, and I still feel that way. So I can only imagine how much harder it is on people that are younger and people that are trying to do the same thing I am, but maybe don't have the same set of tools or just are not far enough along in life. It's very challenging. And, you know, at the end of the day, like you look at things like this, and when you feel helpless, some people turn to drugs. It's never been my way out, but I get it. People turn to drinking, people turn to drugs, people turn to a lot of things to maybe numb the pain or take them away from reality because they can't get what they want out of it. Life can be very tough. Life can be very tough. And I feel bad for people that turn this way and turn, to these drugs or these things. But the reality is that's not the solution. The solution is a better system that can help people sort of realize their potential, can help people understand these things, can help people realize that your purpose is a moving target. And, there's a lot of different ways to contribute to society, but instead, like you said, we don't do any of that stuff. We just now have made drugs free. And what you're doing is you're basically, you're ruining people's lives with this because you're not giving them that other door, that other option. You're not giving them that way out. You're basically just saying, hey, just go waste your life over here. We'll just take care of you because there's nothing else we can do for you. There is. It's just society is so broken, and the way that our government is working is so broken that they think that is the solution, and it really isn't.
So even to me, like creating the system, I think is almost even a little bit backwards in the sense where meaning is derived from responsibility. So like how much responsibility you have in your life is a direct correlation to how important you feel your life is. If people and things depend on your existence and your efforts, then you actually start to feel like you are making a difference in the world, or even just in your community on a little scale. But what we're seeing is all of these policies, this cultural movement is to give more and more of our individual responsibility to the government.
Right.
We're looking at them to solve all of our issues. And I think that is the root of this issue, is instead of believing, okay, I do have the control over the direction of my life, and only I am going to be able to provide my life with meaning. The government isn't going to be able to create some social program that all of a sudden is going to make me feel great on a day-to-day basis. But from a government perspective, if their goal, which I believe it is to always just centralize power and accrue more resources, then that narrative does not help them at all, and it does actually the exact opposite. And so I think they have a built-in incentive to have us in, say, negative mental health spaces in order to want to lean on them more and more.
I agree with that perspective. I think that's a very good compliment to what I was saying. Yeah, that's a really good point. And what I would point out to people is that the government, if just historically look at what they've done, they're not operating in your best interest, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff and finding meaning and finding purpose and sort of maximizing your potential and capability in life. Because look at the programs they currently put in place and look back through history. None of them have been very good, right? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of back to that thing, we're taking ultimate responsibility and just realizing that unfortunately they're not here to help, but you can help yourself.
Actually, just before moving on to the next topic here, one last thing that I think is really interesting is, have I ever mentioned about what happened to the the insane asylums essentially during the Blitz in the UK?
No.
So during the war, when Nazi Germany started bombing the UK, they essentially needed all hands on deck. So everybody all of a sudden had a purpose, right? And everybody in those insane asylums ended up becoming productive members of society. They were driving ambulances, they were help clearing the roads, the injured, all of this kind of stuff. And their mental illnesses almost went away completely. Like, these weren't just all of a sudden, it's not like they were just like an army of schizophrenic people that somebody
definitely be its own battalion.
yeah, send them straight to the front lines. But no, these people became like genuinely productive, and their mental health started to rise as a consequence of feeling like they were able to actually help out their community.
Right.
And so this is actually something that they talk about. Sebastian Junger talks about in his book Tribe, which is really interesting, is how not saying we should go to war for everyone's benefit, but how war actually ends up creating a positive mental health benefit.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's that I think it unites people more than almost anything. Patriotism is deep when stuff like that happens. People want to support their own. But like you said, it gives you a very unilateral focus. If you think about your day to day, you got a million little things going on. You have a couple meetings after this. I got a bunch of stuff to do. We both have busy days. But if our life was focused on one thing, you have to accomplish, and nothing else mattered. The government wasn't bugging us about taxes. We didn't have to worry about all this other crap. You know what I mean? You just focused on this one thing. That really goes a long way for people. It really, really does help clear your mind and keep you focused and keeps you, like they say, a lot of times depression just comes from lack of movement. And I mean that in a holistic way. So yeah, no, I could totally see, it's an interesting study. I could totally see that happening. I don't want to see a war happen, but I mean, hey, there's the silver lining.
Yeah. Yeah. And into one of the interesting findings with that too was the further you were away from the war, the less essentially positive aspects it had on your mental health. So they were even, Sebastian Younger was positing that a large reason of the PTSD within the American soldiers is because they are fighting overseas. They don't feel like they're actually defending their own communities. And then when they come back home, they end up walking around in a culture that is at war with itself, and it's kind of like, why the hell am I overseas fighting these people if we're just fighting ourselves at home?
That's an interesting point.
And so he was talking about how like the PTSD rates in the IDF are actually like less than 1% because it's like
constantly fighting at home.
I need to do this. There's a real purpose for keeping my community safe and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so
I think they have mandatory service there too. Yeah. So I think that also, honestly, I think mandatory service would be such a good thing for society. It's not about going to war. It's about the discipline. It's about finding, it'd be such a good experience for so many people to go and do mandatory service, to learn how to defend yourself, to learn how to take responsibility, to be forced to do shit you don't like. Society has gotten so far as to try to safeguard everybody from doing things they don't want to do. It calluses your mind. It makes you such a weapon when you get up and have to deal with shit every day. Anyway, totally different tangent, but.
Speaking of war, though, we've got Pope Francis calling for Ukraine to wave the white flag. In a recent interview with Swiss broadcaster RSI, Pope Francis urged Ukraine, facing a potential defeat, to courageously engage in peace talks with Russia and not to hesitate to negotiate at the same table. Ukraine has rejected Pope Francis's call to hold negotiations with Russia more than 2 years into its invasion, saying that Kiev will never surrender. At the time of writing this, critics have also compared the Pope's comment to Nazi appeasement. It's pretty hilarious how if you promote peace, you're all of a sudden you're no different than just letting the Nazis off the hook.
This is wild. The Pope is like, hey man, maybe you guys should consider peace, and they're like, you are a Nazi. I'm like, oh my gosh. I realize that's not exactly it. That's just the way it feels. Look, when people are sitting here saying they're never going to surrender, they don't want to find peace. Look at all the young lives we're losing. Look at how many people are dying every day in these wars. They're being sent into a meat grinder. This is not fair to a lot of them. And look, people are like, hey, we're never going to surrender. We're going to win this war. It's been going on for 2 years. You're not making enough progress. All you're doing is losing resources and humans. That's it. Consider the same thing, I guess. This isn't the war that Russia expected. It's not the war that Ukraine expected. This has just become a proxy war for the West. And it's kind of disappointing that, the people or the Ukraine government right now is just unwilling. And look, I'm not saying that I've got the solution here, but every war at some time or another, they do broker peace. That's how this works. Eventually enough people die and they go, all right, let's wave the flag. It really is how it works, right? I just don't know why they're continuing to push this off or what that looks like. I'm not saying you have to give Russia this or that or whatever. I'm not saying, I don't know the answer, but if you do broker peace right now in some sense, the war ends. If you don't, it continues and it will continue to spill over. The issue that I have with it spilling over is, I don't know who you believe on this, but this is what I've read. Putin has repeatedly said that he's not interested in fighting a NATO country. Constantly, he will not push this war beyond Ukraine's border. He has said it so many times. It's been in newspapers. He said it on television, and people are going, oh, well, he's a liar. Okay, well, this is what he constantly says. And if I look at this logically, I go, the only thing that happens if he breaches those borders into NATO territory is he gets annihilated, and you have a massive world war. That can't be his goal. That's not. He's not in this war to lose this war. But if he does that, like very quickly, it could be over for him. So I don't see him having any interest in doing that. And what he's saying is, I don't want to do it. But the media says he's lying. Okay, cool. But what we do know right now is constantly several different countries are talking about putting NATO troops into Ukraine. But we know that is the brightest red line. That is starting World War III, if it's not already started, as you like to suggest. That's exactly what this is. And this conversation's been going on since Macron said it a couple of weeks ago. I know they've talked about it a bit in the past, but since he said that, they have not taken their foot off the gas. A bunch of different countries have suggested, well, maybe we put troops there. Well, maybe there's already some in there. Well, maybe we put EU troops and not NATO. It's like, guys, you're making this worse. The West is just making this war worse right now. Like, I'm not saying that Russia should have definitely not invaded a country. Super not down with that. But right now, the Pope is saying, hey, let's broker some peace. And all that's happening on the West is they're saying, you're a Nazi. We're not going to do this. We're going to keep fighting this war. When I kind of look at it objectively, right now, the West is sort of refusing to try to find a peaceful solution here. And they are kind of making it worse, even though that's probably an unpopular opinion.
It's so annoying having to over-contextualize and be like,
yeah,
just
sorry.
because I say just because I say this, I don't mean this, and I don't just because I say that doesn't mean I think this. But it is true where, okay, not saying that Putin's the good guy here or that he's completely justified in all of his actions, but if you look back at the last few years leading up to his invasion of Ukraine, he was repeatedly warning the West, do not continue to push forward. Do not continue to push forward. You're backing us into a corner. We're eventually going to have to swing. And that's what they did. Yes. And so, you look at this whole narrative, like I think the Nazi appeasement idea comes from the fact that Chamberlain, who was in charge of the UK during leading up to World War II, he very much was a pacifist. He thought everything could be done through diplomatic means, no force is ever necessary, blah, blah, blah. And that ended up leading to Hitler expanding, pushing through different countries. And that the argument is that if Chamberlain never initially took that position, then they would have been more hesitant to push forward and expand their way. Now, that's a very valid argument. I do think there's some issues with the pacifism at all costs narrative, but when you look at who's expanding, at who's starting to push forward with territorial domination, if you look at a global map of the sphere of influence since World War II, America and the West has been expanding. We've been the expansionists.
I think, yeah, to add to your point, I think if you took a step back and looked at this and you were an alien from another planet, you had no horse in the race, and you looked at it that way, the West looks pretty bad up to this point.
Yeah. And, we've made a mention on this podcast before as well, but like when the Soviet Union allowed the West to unify Germany and pulled out of East Germany, they made the agreement that NATO would not go an inch east of Germany. The Soviet Union pretty much said, hey, we don't want to continue. We see a lot of issues going on here between us, like Checkpoint Charlie, where they had tanks literally fucking inches from each other. The American and Soviets, they were about to in Germany. They were like, we realize that this issue, the German issue is pushing things forward, and we want to pull away from the war aspects a little bit. So yeah, we're going to allow you to unify Germany, but we just expect that you take this as like this is your essentially border. Do not cross it. And we've been doing nothing but crossing it for
decades. And we've
decades.
crossed it even more so since this war started, adding 2 more countries to NATO, and now they're looking at adding Ukraine to the EU. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yeah, I mean, like I said, I understand why we are where we are. I can disagree with both sides, and I do.
Yeah, and see, that's for me is like I I side with the Russian citizens, the Ukrainian citizens, the American citizens, and I am opposed to the American government, the Ukrainian government, and the Russian government.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, and so when you see someone like, the Pope sounding off and saying, hey, you guys should wave the white flag, at the end of the day, maybe he should have just said, you guys should look to broker peace and not had, because I understand him saying that to Ukraine feels a little demeaning to them. I get it. But at the end of the day, it's like, you know what we're seeing right now? We're seeing male ego cost hundreds of thousands of lives. That's what we're seeing right now. Because let's be realistic. This is eventually they're going to broker peace. And all we're going to do at the end of this is go, how much money and how many lives were uselessly lost because male ego got in the way and would not find a way through this. It's basically what we're seeing. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I agree. I have been a fan of brokering peace since this thing started. And I agree with the Pope. Like, hey, in a sense, Ukraine is the one under attack, right? And the war is in their country. So that's why I think he's saying wave the white flag. It's like, well, the attack is in your country, right? So Russia being on the attack, well, they're not going to wave the white flag. And I think that's maybe where his sentiment came from. And I think people just got it. They sort of misconstrued. I think his intention was saying, let's find peace. Because at the end of the day, he was in a Western ally nation when he said this. I don't think this was about, one being better than the other. I think he's just going, look, it's in your country. This is where it's happening, and you guys are suffering the most right now. Consider this. And he just got shit on for it, which it is what it is, man. I mean, I think it's a good sign, though, to show you how wild things are right now when the Pope can't say anything. Like when the Pope says, hey, let's find peace, and they say that it's a Nazi appeasement. I think that just kind of shows you how out of hand the situation currently is.
And to me, it's just funny that the West gets this whole narrative of, oh, we're doing it for moral reasons. We want to protect Ukraine and its democracy and blah, blah, blah. And first of all, Ukraine has been one of the most corrupt nations for the past few decades.
Admittedly.
Yeah.
Like...
And then also you look at America and you go, I don't know if there's been any government that's overthrown more democratically elected leaders than the CIA.
Oh yeah.
Like so you go like, oh okay, yeah, I'm supposed to believe that all of a sudden this country is all like America has reclaimed its moral high ground and refound its identity of being a non-imperialist nation and all of this kind of stuff. It is really actually interesting when you go look back at the American attitudes before World War I and World War II about their extreme non-interventionist policies, and they pretty much said at all times, until they got dragged into it in both by getting attacked by especially in the World War II with the Japanese, and in World War I the Germans started firing on American ships, which pulled them into it. But before that, yeah, it was like, you guys are all stupid. Why are you guys fighting over these kind of things? Let's sit down at a table and figure this out and how to avoid the mass casualties. And now it's just their sole goal is to keep the war machine turning.
Yeah, it's interesting though. You're right. I really noticed it after the Second World War, when they became the superpower and dropped those atomic bombs. That was when they flipped that switch of the military-industrial complex in a big way. I don't know how much they were doing that leading up to that point in time, but it's like that is when they became a totally different beast.
Did you ever hear Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd highly suggest anybody listening to go check that out. Who, Eisenhower, president post-World War II, was talking about how there was mechanisms in taking over in America, which he coined the term military-industrial complex and said, if we're not careful, if we don't keep a close eye on this will erode what we know to be as American democracy, and this will all of a sudden start calling the shots. And I mean, it looks like that's definitely the case.
Yeah, I mean, he had an inside look, and who to tell you, who to know better than that person. But it seems like since then they've done everything they can to make sure they have a leader in place that sort of toes that line, which is just, again, goes to show you like how little control do we actually have over society, and how much of a democracy do we really live in?
100%. All right, last story for the day here. Wall Street is retreating from activism due to an economic clash. Wall Street is grappling with the growing challenge of reconciling the divergent objectives of progressive activism and shareholder returns. Major players such as BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, and State Street recently withdrew from Climate Action 100 Plus, a coalition of leading fund managers committed to compelling major corporate greenhouse gas emitters to address climate change. Larry Fink, BlackRock's CEO, has shifted the firm's focus towards stakeholder capitalism. So, is this a move in the right direction, or do you think it is a essentially stick and move? Kind of, yeah, we're backing away from this, but really, when Larry Fink, says we're putting our focus now towards stakeholder capitalism, seems like they're just changing their direction, but not actually reverting it.
Well, there's a couple things here. First, I'm not actually sure how they were able to get away with this for so long, because you have a fiduciary duty to shareholders to maximize profitability, essentially, right? And we know that a lot of these ESG products, companies rather, positions, they were hurting their bottom line. So was this just something they ran with as long as they could to try to implement this new policy, and why? I don't know.
Can I give you their argument for that?
Sure,
for the fiduciary responsibility argument? What they would say is that climate change is going to have a extreme economic impact, and therefore we are being responsible for our stakeholders or shareholders, because if we don't address this, the losses on the economic side that we're going to face decades from now are going to be peanuts compared to what we lose now.
Okay, so the question would be then, if it was so righteous, why are they running from it now,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're like, well, this is our hard line, this is what makes the most sense, and now they're flipping, that's a bit of a surprise, don't you think?
I think it's bullshit. Like, I don't think it's a good argument, but that's the argument I've heard them made multiple times, is that it is still financially responsible because they're limiting the effects of climate change.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, they've already flipped on that, so obviously that wasn't the case. I mean, here's the thing. I have a couple perspectives on this. One, this is one of the few times that I think corporate greed is positive. Because it's pushing them away from all this sort of more ideological stuff that is not really scientifically backed in a lot of cases, right? I'm not saying don't support the environment and stuff like that. I'm just saying that we shouldn't be doing it to the detriment of society. That's kind of my perspective. The other thing that I would suggest here is these guys appear to be, they are sort of controlling the narrative and how society goes in a lot of ways because of how much financial power they have, right? So I would be cautious of saying, where are they moving to next? What is their next target? Because this is the first time that I've really noticed their impact beyond what's happening behind the curtain, because of their control in sort of the ESG space and not investing into or controlling these companies by getting on their board and dictating how they have to behave in this way. This is the first time I've seen them sort of take this cultural stance. Maybe you've seen it before. I don't know. This is the first time I've seen it. Now that they've done this, is this going to be the norm for them? Are they going to move on to some new cultural issue that we're not going to really see until it sort of starts coming to fruition? I guess what I'm saying is this concerns me in the sense that they found a way to control the cultural perspective in society through policy, even though they're not the ones even though they're not the ones implementing policy, they're just shaping it. So now what's next? They took us down this line, which made no sense. What direction are they going to go now that they've kind of moved on from this one? Do you know what I mean?
It goes to show their hypocrisy of it all too, because, like, for instance, this is something that I've heard Vivek talk about, where BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, all of this kind of stuff, they will vote in new Exxon directors or whatever company they want.
Yeah.
But let's use Exxon for this example. And then they immediately cut their production by 20% in order to meet environmental goals. And then who picks up that void in the market of oil production? Russia, China, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then you go look at who is the majority owner of PetroChina, and it's BlackRock.
Right. So they're just manipulating markets.
Yes. And it's just top to bottom manipulation. It's the idea that the house always wins. They'll cut production here, prices skyrocket for us, and they end up just making their money in another market.
That's pretty dark. But one concern and one thing I want to highlight, when they are promoting or supporting ESG companies, this becomes evident, right? Because for companies to behave in that way, they have to pull certain levers so that society can identify that they're following those guidelines. With this new stakeholder capitalism thing, you're not really going to see it coming. You're not really going to see it coming. There's going to be a lot of groundwork they're going to lay in the background. And then all of a sudden, society is going to become, I don't know exactly how, I don't even know how they're going to implement it. But if that is their intention and that is their goal, and that's the kind of manipulation they have, we are not going to see this coming.
That's my whole the concept that I've talked about with turnkey totalitarianism. I believe they're getting everything put in place, and then all they have to do is just flick a switch, essentially, and all of these things come live.
And that's why this is so concerning. Everyone looks at it and goes, oh, good, they're moving away from ESG. And it's like, yeah, but they're doubling down on something that's a lot darker. And it is going to push forward this initiative that we've seen come through or sort of come to fruition in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that I would agree with, and I think it's the easiest way for people to see, is how unaffordable it has become to live in Canada. How unaffordable it has become just to try to survive and put food on the table. And that the government is going to provide you with a solution, whether that is the universal basic income, whatever that looks like. That's what I think exactly what it looks like, to be honest with you. But they're continuing to move us in this direction. And now what they're going to do is they're going to implement, like you said, this big move towards stakeholder capitalism. And these are the most powerful companies in the world that they can literally move anything in the economy in any direction they want because they've got stake in everything. I think BlackRock's like a $10 trillion company. I think next is, I think they're like 2 or 3 times bigger than anyone else.
That, yeah.
And then next it's like, you have BlackRock. There's BlackRock,
Vanguard, State Street.
but there's one other one that's in there that you'd know as well. That's kind of in that echelon. But I believe BlackRock's I think BlackRock around 10 trillion is 3 times bigger than anybody else.
Wow.
Anyway.
We talk about antitrust and monopolies, and you look at this and you go, okay, so the Climate Action 100 Plus group, the investors, because it was kind of like a conglomerate of different investors and funds and stuff that are part of that. But that group had over 50% of the market share, the people that were involved in that, when you factor in all of these different companies and put them together that are all operating on the same agenda. Like, how is that not a monopoly? You've got a handful of people that own essentially 50% of or more of the economy.
So the problem is they've become too big that there's no one to keep them in check anymore. No one in the government has that kind of power. Larry Fink is the guy, one of the guys running the world right now, that we can see. You know what I mean? He's the one that's in front of the curtain, not behind it. How do you...
What's crazy is, it's easy to look at it and go, they got out of control on their own, and the government can't even rein them in at this point. But the government is in a large part responsible for them being as big as they are. You can't... I challenge any single person to try to find me a company that has a monopoly that doesn't have great intertwinings with the government, whether it come through subsidies or preferred regulations. Every monopoly is built on the back end of the government. And you even look at okay, who did the government get to come in and organize the bailout of the 2008 financial crisis? BlackRock.
Right.
Who has the government looked at restructuring Ukraine after the war ends? BlackRock. And it's so to me, it's we can't even possibly look to the government and go, why are they, or how can they rein them in when they're directly responsible for who they are and how big they are now?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, so I was just looking that up right now. So BlackRock is around 10, Vanguard's around 8.5. And then the next one in line behind them is Fidelity Management. They're around 3.5, 4. Approximately. But it's just crazy. Just if you look at you put Vanguard and BlackRock together in a group and you go, they control more than, I think, the next bottom 10, guys. And that's just in the, sort of asset management world. I don't know how deep this goes, but like you said, they're controlling everything everywhere, whether it's oil in America to what's happening maybe, the Middle East versus or in addition to, both starting and rebuilding in that war in Ukraine. It's what do these people not have their hands on? So I guess the big thing that I would say is this should just be one giant red flag that you're looking at. The people that are basically controlling the economy around the entire world just said, we're on board with this stakeholder capitalism idea that the World Economic Forum is pushing. This is a really bad sign. That's what I would say more than anything. I don't know where it goes. I don't know how quickly it moves, but I would just say this is a bad marker. We've hit a really bad checkpoint.
it's definitely concerning, the route that those kind of things are taking, and essentially the global monopolies that are being made at the present moment. And yeah, when you look at, like, even go look at any single top company in America, or even just around right now, and go look at their top shareholders, and those three companies you listed are always in the top 5, with at least one or two of them being in the 1 or 2 spots.
The primary, it's wild.
And it's just, although there is an argument to be made. So a lot of people would look at that and go, okay, they have direct voting influence over these companies as their largest shareholders, but something with the way that BlackRock and these funds are set up is that the fund holders, the people in charge of these funds, so BlackRock themselves, they don't actually necessarily have the voting decision making. It's the people that buy into their funds do. So like, let's say a vote gets had for a company on the new direction it's taking, or a change. Let's say you're the owner of the fund. You don't vote on it, but if I gave you my money to invest in those companies, then it would be my vote. However, I've also heard that it's staggeringly few amount of people that actually go through with that. So it does end up maybe being they lead the charge and still push these things either way. But
there are ways to structure it so that the head of the snake still controls things, despite how the fund is split up. There's just ways to, like with your board of directors and how you kind of manage that, and corporate governance, there's ways to keep those things so that whoever's steering the ship is the one in charge, or it's a small group of people. And you have to imagine, with $10 trillion funds, these guys have that organized. You want in on it? Great. Give us your money and you get a return. You don't get any say. Not that saying, like that situation with Elon Musk, where that guy that stopped him from getting that $53 billion payout, that guy had like 10 shares. That guy, it's wild, but he was able to, he had some shares, so he went to a lawyer, gave it this big push, and then stopped him from getting all this money, which I disagree with, because they had a contract in place. Musk met the threshold for the contract. They agreed to it. I think he should have been paid. At the end of the day, not a huge deal, but just my point being, in that particular case, a guy with 10 shares had control. There's no way these people are shaping the world, and then they've got that sort of corporate governance in place. No chance at all.
All right. Anything else you wanted to add today before we get out of here?
That is everything.
All right. Don't forget to head over to our website to sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week, blendrnews.com. That's BLENDR news.com. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.